Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So with the rising prices of memory and the rising prices of storage, along with all the tariffs being in the mix, and this looking like it's not going to solve itself for probably the next couple of years, I decided to break my piggy bank and purchase myself a Minisforum MS-S1 Max, and this thing is a massive beast. But I'm hoping to use it for some videos I have planned for 2026. So the MS-S1 Max has an AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 and 128 gigabytes of memory, if you can imagine, which is LPDDR5X integral memory, and that integrated memory has a performance of 8,000 megatransfers per second. It also has or comes with a 2 terabyte NVMe drive, and the GPU is a Radeon 8060S. There are also two USB 4 40 gigabit ports on the front of the unit, and there are two USB 4 version 2 80 gigabit ports on the rear of the unit. And it has a PCI Express X16 slot that sadly is only PCI Express X4 compatible electrically, meaning that it provides you 4 lanes of PCI Express on the add-in slot. So this machine has dual 10 gigabit NICs, and they are the new Realtek RTL 8127 controller, and they're not yet a part of the Linux 6.8 kernel, and that's something you should be aware of. And so let's see the issues I had in trying to install Ubuntu Server on the system, and I want to start by taking a look at BTOP on this system. So we have cores 0, C0 out through C31, which are 32 threads. It has 16 cores, 2 threads per core, and so therefore 32 pseudo cores. And we have 124 gigabytes of memory listed here, yet we see in some other listings where it does have 128 gigabytes of memory. I don't know, BTOP's just a little bit different. I have 2 drives installed in the system. I have a 2 terabyte NVMe and a 4 terabyte NVMe. So it shipped with Windows 11 Pro, and this is where everything began to get just a bit interesting. So in initial power on, it went into the classic Windows Mini setup for, believe it or not, 90 minutes until the system was available for my use. And it shipped with secure boot and fast boot enabled, and so therefore there was no way to hit the delete key, the F2 key, the escape key, or the Minisforum F7 key, which allows you to boot an alternate operating system the way that the system was delivered. And so I had to wait the 90-minute mandatory Windows setup period for it to complete, and I still thought for the speed of this system, 90 minutes really didn't make sense. So more on that later. So the MS-S1 is EFI only, and it has no legacy boot. And you're going to want to remember that as we proceed on in today's presentation. So I had to wait for Windows Install to complete so that I could choose the Advanced Setup option to enter the Minisforum BIOS settings. And if you've never done this before, basically you go into the System Recovery option in Windows, you go down to Advanced Setup, and you click on the Restart Now. That brings you to a screen where you can choose the Troubleshoot option, and that brings you to a screen where you can choose the Advanced Options option. And that brings you to the Advanced Options screen where there's an option to choose the UEFI firmware settings, and then you have the only option at that point is to click the Restart button, and that actually brings you up into the BIOS for the machine. So what about this overall Minisforum experience here? Well, once in the BIOS, I could turn off Secure Boot and I could change the boot priority to boot to my Ubuntu 2404 server live disk because that's what I wanted to install. And essentially, I was going to follow my video Incus container step by step because my goal was to create a really high-end Incus server that had some AI capabilities, which I plan to leverage in later videos. So this allowed me to install Ubuntu Server. Well, kind of. So my experience here is when I went to boot it, Windows just really didn't want to behave. That is that when I went into the Ubuntu server and I tried to delete the Windows partitions, for whatever reason, the Ubuntu 2404 server setup wasn't cooperating with me. So I turned around and I booted an Ubuntu desktop live version and I went into gparted and I deleted the Windows partitions and I deleted the partition table and I went ahead and went back and rebooted the Ubuntu 2404 server live disk, and I was allowed to continue from there. Why that happened, I'm not entirely sure, but that's what I had to do. So installation continued normally with Ubuntu server, but it was extremely slow for Linux, and it kind of echoed the slowness that I had in the Windows 11 Mini setup, but it wasn't 90 minutes. Still, it was like 30 minutes. And for those of you who have ever installed Ubuntu Server on something, you know that generally that's maybe a 5-minute process. It really doesn't take much longer than that unless you're running on some really old, slow server. So after the system was booted, the 10 gigabit adapters were not available because the RTL 8125 class of drivers, and this machine was using the RTL 8127 device. Those drivers are not a part of the Linux 6.8 kernel, and I was kind of suspecting as much. So my first step was to install the Ethernet drivers. And normally, we talk about the fact that in Linux, we never have to, quote, install drivers unless it's usually for like a video card. And it's not that Linux doesn't use drivers, it's just that the drivers are an integral part of the kernel. And so you're not having to take the step of installing drivers for things unless that device does not have support for it in the kernel. And this RTL 8127 10 gigabit adapters that were in the Minisforum MS-S1 Max were one such case. So I had to install the NIC drivers. So first of all, I installed some dependencies. I did a build essential, DKMS, Git, and then the Linux headers for my specific version of Ubuntu 2404. So in other words, the headers for the Linux kernel 6.8. And then I did a git clone of the Realtek R8125 series drivers, and it took me a little while to find the exact correct package. So for those of you that might be trying to implement that driver package, here's what you can do. And I'll go ahead and put some short show notes together, which will indicate that. And then I did a copy of these drivers over to a location because they weren't really the drivers, they were the source code for the drivers, right? And then we went ahead and did a sudo dkms add, followed by a sudo dkms build, followed by a sudo dkms install. And then at that point, I could do a sudo mod probe on R8125. So as we run down to the terminal here, I can do an ls mod and I can grep R8125, and there R8125 series drivers are present. Next, I did an lspci and I grepped net, and I found 3 network devices. The first 2 are the RTL 8127 10 gigabit controllers because there's 2 of them on the back of the MS-S1 Max, and the third device here is a MediaTek controller, which is a Wi-Fi 7 controller that is also a part of the unit. And then I did an IP link and I grepped for ENP asterisk. Now this is really interesting. And what makes this really interesting is because the device names were ENP 97S0, ENP 98S0, and WLP 99S0. So unfortunately, I did this screenshot later in the final form of the machine, but in the initial form of the machine, the devices were ENP 7, ENP 8, and WLP 9. So we're going to talk about how they got to be 97, 98, and 99 instead of just 7, 8, and 9. So the next thing that happened is after a couple of hours of running in this state, the system locked up. And I looked around for a long time, couldn't really find anything specifically, but since this is a brand new system, I went ahead and went out to the Minisforum site, went down to the support section of the site, and I went ahead and went into the download section, and sure enough, they had a new version of the BIOS available. And that's kind of interesting because my desktop machine here is a Minisforum UM890 Pro, and it came out a year or so ago, and to my knowledge, it does not yet have a new version of the BIOS. The other thing you should know is that here we're showing the BIOS upgrade process in this screenshot. Well, the BIOS upgrade option is not built into the BIOS of the machine. Instead, you download that file, and once you download the file, you unzip it, and once you unzip it, you take those files and copy them to the top level of a USB drive. You insert that USB drive, and that's not a bootable USB drive, it's just a USB drive with those files on it. You insert that into the Minisforum MS-S1 Max in this case, and then you go ahead and boot the system up. No, you don't choose a boot drive or anything. It kind of just sees it and goes, wow, I found a drive out here that seems to have some firmware updates on it. Would you like to upgrade the firmware? And you answer yes, and it goes off into the process that you see here. So after the BIOS update was completed, the system booted way faster. So prior to this, it was taking something like 2.5 minutes to boot. And I would have expected that to be a lot faster on a beast like the MS-S1 Max. And my thoughts were accurate. And so I noticed this slowness in obviously the Windows, and I noticed this slowness in the installation of Ubuntu. So that's kind of what led me to the BIOS upgrade in addition to that lockup we mentioned. So my 10 gigabit device names ended up changing here, and that's when we got the new device names I pointed out. And the reason for that is because when you do a firmware update, it's quite possible that it will re-enumerate the PCI Express bus, and when it re-enumerates the bus, the device names can in fact change, and that's what happened to me. So I had no network connection at this point, and the reason I didn't is because I had to head on over to /etsy/netplan and adjust my netplan file for the new device names. But after I did that, I still had no network, and part of the reason for that is because the BIOS update decided to re-enable Secure Boot, and that wasn't immediately obvious because the Secure Boot option is like 3 levels deep in the BIOS. So the RTL8127 device drivers are outside the kernel. That's what we did when we did the install here just a minute ago. And they were not signed drivers, so that kind of prevented them from loading if Secure Boot was enabled, so I definitely needed to disable Secure Boot. And after turning Secure Boot off and rebooting and also adjusting the names in the netplan file, the system was up and running, and I had network, and it was fast. So I had my network back, and I was a happy camper. So 24 hours later, guess what? I could ping this system, but I couldn't SSH to it. And all the Incus containers appeared to be locked up, and I couldn't SSH to any of them either. So I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And so most traditional servers, Intel or say older AMD devices, provide a text mode console via VGA or via what's called the EFI graphics output protocol. And so when Linux boots and it doesn't have any console specified, it automatically binds to /dev/tty to whatever the firmware exposes. And so that normally happens all the time, and I kind of take it for granted. And in this particular case, the MS-S1 Max is solely EFI firmware, and it has no legacy VGA fallback, which is found in legacy ROMs, and this is what makes all of the difference. So there's no text mode virtual terminal exposed by default. And this results in session-dependent operations like interactive SSH and things like auto-mounting NFS drives to fail, and my NFS drives weren't mounting, and my Incus containers appeared started, but they weren't reachable, and I couldn't SSH to the machine. So there were multiple things happening to me basically at once. And even though the HDMI console device saw output, in other words, that's how I originally installed Ubuntu, I could connect to the HDMI and I could hit enter and I could sign in with my username and password to my view. I thought that the console was up and running just fine. It was great. So not a problem. Unfortunately, this system essentially had no physical TTY device to associate with it, and internally Linux really wants to have a TTY. So I went in to fix Grub. For those of you that don't know, Grub is the Grand Unified Bootloader, which is the boot manager for Linux. You can edit the bootloader by doing a sudo nano /etc/default/grub. Here's the nano session for when I went in and edited that. So we have here the group grub _cmd line _ Linux _ default. And it was looking like the next line here, which is the command line Linux. And it was just quote. I added the console equals TTY0 so that it would explicitly define a TTY device, and that's what it needed. So after that, I went and did a sudo update -grub, which rewrites all of the grub boot files in order for the system to be able to use them with the changes that I made. And then I did a sudo reboot now. So after the firmware update and after adding the TTY, believe it or not, the system booted from power on in under 10 seconds. So that led me to believe that the TTY problem, along with the firmware problem, were what was causing the system to run excessively slow before. But I think, honestly, it really came down to the firmware. The reason I say that is because Windows was also slow, and it didn't have a Linux TTY issue because Windows is not Linux. So this speed included mounting 5 NFS shares. So we're booting from power on. The machine does a post test. It comes all the way up. It boots up, and it actually mounts 5 NFS shares in under 10 seconds. And I was just completely blown away by that. And then less than 20 seconds after that, 15 Incus containers that I had moved over to this new machine were actually fully online with their addresses. They were reachable, and their applications were up and running. And so, yes, I really love this system. It's an absolute killer, and it is fantastic. So my final net plan file kind of looked like this. I needed to upgrade for ENP97S0 instead of ENP7S0 because of the PCI Express Bus enumeration I pointed out. And then we have our bridge device. And basically this netplan file is patterned after exactly what I do in my video, Incas Containers Step by Step, where I talk about setting up the network with a software bridge. The software bridge is required in order to allow multiple containers to get separate addresses and be able to function out on the mainland or on VLANs and operate accordingly. And then down here I have my default route, which is to the gateway address of my UDM Pro. On my system, that's 172.16.0.1. And then my name servers, my primary name server, 172.16.0.10, I've covered before on the channel, where I was talking about Pi-hole in conjunction with VRRP, which is Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol. I actually have 3 different Pi-holes that operate as a primary, a failover secondary, and a failover tertiary, because I want my local DNS to always be available. And then the fallback name server address is Cloudflare. So that's basically what there is to my netplan file. So in summary, Minisforum firmware is installed from a USB device with the update files at its root. And there is no BIOS update option in the actual BIOS, so don't hunt around for it. You're not going to find it. And I updated to the Minisforum MS-S1 Max version 1.06, which I found on the Minisforum site, and that seemed to correct my problem. And now the system is running flawlessly after a few days of operation with no unusual errors and no lockups. And I believe the original firmware was flawed based on how slow both Windows and Ubuntu Server actually were. Either that or my firmware install on this particular machine might not have really passed the bench test when it left the factory, but they didn't notice that, and so it was kind of working. And so I was annoyed that Secure Boot was buried 3 levels deep in the BIOS menu, and I was also pretty annoyed by the fact that after I upgraded the firmware, it decided arbitrarily to turn Secure Boot back on, and that required several more hours of me digging around to figure out what the exact problem was. And so it was excessively hard to get into the BIOS initially. And in fact, the only way I actually mentioned getting into the BIOS is because it was what I needed to do in order to install Ubuntu. And I had to go through Windows, as I showed you, in order to accomplish that. And I shouldn't have to do that. So the console equals TTY0 issue was new to me, because this is actually the first time that I've worked with a machine that had a UEFI only system and not a legacy boot fallback. So the 32 threads and the 128 gigabytes of LPDDR5X make this system the fastest mini PC. Hey, let's not say mini PC, let's call it what it is, mini workstation that I've ever seen. And so although I was absolutely stunned at its $3,000 price, which is going up, I honestly have to say that since I was worried about being able to acquire a reasonable machine in the next 2 years, this was a solution. Plus, this is where I want the channel to go, and I want to have an opportunity to be able to show off some AI types of applications and things we can do having a little bit more CPU power. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.